Hello, welcome. So glad to have everyone here. We're going to wait a few seconds to make sure that everybody's properly logged in, that my audio is properly working, that the system is completely ready for the next 1 hour to cover everything that we know at this stage about the EPSO AD5 Generalist exam. So we'll wait a second or two. And while we do that, why don't you type into the chat box where you are dialing in from? That's our customary prompt, customary query, customary way to start a webinar of this kind, so I can see how diverse the audience is, because you are many and you are coming from all over. Many of you are in Brussels. I can see the comments rolling in from Amsterdam, from Spain, from Latvia, from Hanover, from France, literally from all over Europe and presumably the world. So let's get started, because we have a lot to cover and an extremely exciting opportunity, an extremely exciting time when it comes to EU careers and when it comes to EPSO. So we're going to go through each and every thing that we can know about it at this stage. Making sure that you can hear me well. If there is any technical glitch, if there is any concern, then restarting the browser or refreshing the page is probably going to solve 99% of the cases. The remaining 1%, you can open a new browser if you have another one on your device. And as a last resort, you can download the app. Unless you're already watching it on it, you can type in the meeting event ID, which you can see on the screen. So if you're concerned about that, then make sure you take note of that. So with that, please put questions into the chat box, because I would like to make this interactive, though there's a lot to cover. So I will not have an enormous amount of time to answer questions live. But as we will see, there is going to be a format. We're going to find a way to answer all questions that are of common concern and do not concern individual cases, but common concern to everyone. I'm going to find a way to follow up on that in case I cannot answer all of them, which is almost certainly going to be the case, given that we have about an hour and we have hundreds and hundreds of you joining today's webinar. So that's my background, and that's me. Many of you might know my work. I have been with EU training for almost 15 years and dealing with EU careers, I would say over 2 decades by now. So I hope to have a certain perspective that I can share with you and that can be helpful for you. And please connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. So if you would like to see other parts of my work, you're more than welcome to do so. So with that, making sure that within a day, you're going to get all the slides that I'm sharing here with you. And you're also going to get the recording, not necessarily within a day, but within a very reasonable amount of time. You will be able to look it up, to use it as a reference material, come back to it. And you will certainly get a notification about it in your email inbox, because most of you, if not all of you, are already registered, so we can follow up with our communication. Now, we are going to most likely do a dedicated Q&A recording to answer all the questions that I will not have time for, meaning that I'm going to sit here, pick up all the questions that are coming in as I speak, and whatever is not answered today, I'm going to release a recording to you to make sure that your question, your query is answered. So that's going to probably happen within a week, and we're going to notify you in your email inbox just the same. Few words about EU training. Many of you are already using our services, and some of you might be new to it. So just a very short recap. We're a large community of EU career enthusiasts, and more than enthusiasts, many of those who have already passed the competition and they are working in the EU in one capacity, one way or another, but they would like to advance in their career or get a different contract. Well, they are also part of the community, and we have a pretty robust followership on Facebook. You are welcome to join us there as well. If you're not on Facebook or you prefer LinkedIn, also there's an increasing community on LinkedIn as well. And then we have a lot of practice tests and questions and materials. Over 17 million questions have been used so far, so that's quite a lot. The generated different kind of exams that users have put together, and certainly a lot of webinars and a lot of other resources that I trust are helpful for methodology, for your preparation, for all sorts of things. So I'll pause here for a second and just to do kind of setting the scene. We are here today because EPSO is about to release and publish the largest competition of the past 6 years, which give possibility and give an opportunity to an enormous amount of candidates to become EU officials and get a permanent contract and work for European institutions as a European civil servant. So that, in some sense, in this niche of the universe, this is a historic opportunity. Now, some of you may be not so familiar with the entire process and how that works. And some of you may be intimately familiar because you've already done a lot of exams and a lot of competitions. But I want to be sure that we're helpful and informative and comprehensive to everyone. So we're going to do a quick overview of the steps, of the process, of everything else. And first thing first, EPSO is the European Personnel Selection Office, which is an important distinction to say that EPSO does selection, but they don't do recruitment. So what they do is select suitable candidates who can then be hired, recruited into specific positions. So there's no concrete vacancy that they are hiring for. It's the aptitude, the ability of those candidates to be eligible to be hired in the end. So the selection process in a nutshell is pretty much what you see on the screen. There's always an application, and then the most difficult, challenging part are the selection tests. You need to send in supporting documents, which often needs to be done after the actual exam, or at least close to it. Occasionally, it might be a few days, few weeks before, but the bottom line is the application deadline is usually earlier. So you have a bit more time to get hold of your degree, or if it has to be then homologué, has to be the equivalence of it has to be established for the European system if you got your degree outside of the EU, to make sure that there's an equivalence established. So there's a bit more time. Then they do the eligibility checks. So making sure that your documents and your background, everything holds up to their expectations and the requirements. And ultimately, there's a reservist. And I put to the corner that little box where I say recruitment, which is not formally part of the European Personnel Selection Office remit. They are not into the business of recruitment. But of course, there's a very close connection with the recruiting services who can then hire you based on the reserve list, your presence on the reserve list. So let's look at the EPSO AD5 Generalist exam, as commonly referred to among those who are really into it. Is just AD5 or Generalist. So that's typically the shorthand, that's typically the reference. So probably that's what I'm going to be using in the next hour or so. So before anything else, I really want to say a word of big disclaimer. And that's not just a lawyer in me, but it's also for our integrity as a private company who are not linked to EPSO in any way. So what we do here is help candidates succeed, and we help to give you all the tools and resources and guidance and test and practice to succeed. Now, having said that, at this point, when we're recording this, we're in April 2025, we know a lot, but we don't know everything. And we have heard rumors. We are following the news very closely. We are observing the trends. We are doing a lot of, dare I say, intelligence around European careers and specifically the AD5 Generalist exam. But there are a couple of open questions. And those open questions will only be known and only be answered and only be 100% sure, legally, practically speaking, when the notice of competition is released. And at this point, it's planned to be released in July 2025. So pretty much, so there's May, June, July. So roughly 3 months from now, at the time of recording, that's when certain nuances and certain, not so much missing pieces, but open questions will be answered. And I will always point out what those are. I want to be sure that you have a clear idea of what we know and what we are speculating, but don't necessarily 100% know. So that's an important distinction. But one key message, why are we doing this webinar now and why not in July? And chances are we're going to be doing something like this in July when we have the very specific details already published. The reason we're doing it now, this is a gigantic competition, and gigantic in the sense that tens of thousands of candidates are expected, and also in terms of the reserve list, which you'll see in a second. great opportunity. And that means you are very encouraged, highly encouraged to start practicing, to start planning, to start taking this seriously already at this stage. Because if you start preparing when the exam, the competition is published, when it's launched, I wouldn't say it's too late, but it gives you much more limited time. So those who take it seriously, and I encourage you to be among those who take it seriously, you would like to start preparing already at this stage. And for those of you who may be less familiar with the system, I encourage you to look at it, the different building blocks I'm walking you through now, to be sure that you can already start planning your preparation, and not just planning, but acting on it, making sure that you get started. So first and foremost, how many places on the reserve list are we expecting? And we're expecting around 1,000 or perhaps a little more. Now, to put that in perspective, most European personnel selection office, so EPSO competitions, have far fewer places on the reserve list than that. So it could be a couple hundred, it could be a handful, a couple dozen. But again, I'm not aware of any competition in the past few years that had such a large reserve list. And again, this is one of those things that I mentioned before. It's somewhat of a speculation, or let's say it's an informed guess. So we are expecting around that number to be available on the reserve list. And that's ultimately what gives a good indication of your chances, though one part of that variable is unknown, is how many candidates are going to be. But if you come with the assumption that 30,000 candidates might apply, obviously you can calculate with 1,000 places. That's still a very, very intense competition where you really need to perform among the best. Where are you going to work once you succeed, once you're hired? It's quite an open book. So Brussels and Luxembourg are the most immediate guesses because most EU institutions are located there, here in a sense, as I'm saying it, at Square Ambiorix, hence Ambiorix Studio, where we're broadcasting this from. So Brussels and Luxembourg are the most immediate and the most likely options, but there are EU representations and delegations around the world, while representations inside the European Union member states and delegations in third countries, which is not third world countries, but third countries as in outside of the European Union. So you might end up over your career, perhaps not immediately, to work in one of those countries where the European Union is present. Now, which institutions are ultimately the clients of EPSO, or the clients for this particular competition for the AD5 Generalist? Well, essentially all EU institutions and bodies. EU agencies are not necessarily part of that. So EU agencies may not be hiring, or by default, they are not necessarily hiring permanent officials. And that means the institution or body that will hire you as an EU official from the reserve list are pretty much the ones that you see on the screen, from the Committee of Regions to the Court of Justice to the European Commission to the Council of the EU to many others. Now, this is not something you know in advance. This is not something that you can determine in advance, because the AD5 Generalist, by the very nature of the term generalist, well, they are not looking for specialists. So that is not to say you cannot be specialist in microbiology or nuclear science or macroeconomics. Obviously, that's a great thing. But this is not a prerequisite for you to apply or to participate in this competition, because it's aiming at a very broad brush. It's really looking at a large diversity of profiles to hire, and therefore they don't necessarily say that in advance how or which institution you are going to end up working for. It also largely depends on the vacancies. It depends on where there's a particular vacancy that they want to fill from those who are on the reserve list. What are you going to do? And we couldn't resist, but really couldn't resist using this, well, I'd say lighthearted poster that I had done, I think it was like good 10, rather 15 years ago, where somebody was asking, okay, what do EU officials do? And it was pretty popular at the time, these kind of memes to say, okay, what my friends think I do is hanging out with important people. What society thinks is just counting with a lot of, dealing with a lot of money. What the boss thinks is not much. What my partner thinks I do, that I'm totally overwhelmed. And what I really do is deleting emails. Now, certainly EU officials do far more than than that, and very different kind of things, because again, there's a great diversity, not just among the institutions, but the actual job profiles that you end up doing. And that could be really dealing with trade issues, dealing with competition cases, dealing with payrolls, dealing with translation, interpreting. There's a whole range of things. And over your career, you can transit from one position into another. So again, that's a very diverse and again, very colorful international organization in the sense of careers, of the kind of job content that you end up doing. Now let's look at very specifically at the competition and what is it that you must know, what is that can help your preparation and your planning to make the most out of it. Well, there are general requirements and there are specific requirements. And we're going to look at the general requirements, which are, I can almost guarantee that this is going to be the case, that there's not much uncertainty here. Definitely, you'll need to have an EU citizenship. You need to have fulfilled your military service if that's required in your country of your citizenship. I think it's in Greece, in perhaps Austria, or there are some member states where this is compulsory. It really depends on the country of your citizenship. You need to meet the character requirements, and that might have an impact on security clearance if you end up doing a position or doing a certain task that requires that sort of clearance. But generally, with a criminal record, I'm not sure you would be a good fit for the institutions. And perhaps the most practical part of that is your knowledge of EU languages, and most notably two specific, well, I wouldn't say specific, but two official EU languages. And the language regime is always a tricky thing because, as you will see in a second, also with the qualifications and work experience, but again, with languages, that's tricky, obviously for political reasons as to the quality of languages, or are some languages more important than others, because English, French, and German are working languages of the European institutions. But for the sake of the competition, for the purposes of the competition that we're looking at right now, that is more delicate because there have been a lot of court cases about the use of languages in the application process, which is very clear-cut, can be done in any of the 24 languages. But there were cases when some competitions required English or French or German, and then there was issue with Spanish and Italian and some other languages. So that was a bit tricky. Now, what is it that we're expecting in this competition, following a trend that we've been observing with other competitions in the past 1 year, if not more? And that is that you need to know two official EU languages. And we are expecting that this is going to be no different this time. Any of the 24 official EU languages, and basically any of the 23 remaining official languages. So you need to pick two. The expected level is not exactly the same, but the second language can be a little less fluent, so to say. But there's not going to be any limitation to English or French or German. And again, we'll see the notice of competition. But this is, I would say, I would give it an extremely high probability that this is going to be the linguistic regime for the upcoming competition. And that's interesting because you might as well choose Czech and Slovak, or you might as well choose French and Greek, or any combination whatsoever. There's no specific emphasis or added emphasis on English, French, or German. You're welcome to choose those languages. And this is not linked to your citizenship. This is not linked to even where you live. So I could choose Latvian, though my Latvian would not probably be sufficient for me to pass any of the competitions because I don't speak a single word in that language. So certainly this is just to say in an exaggerated manner, but just to say that you can literally choose any of the 24 official languages without having any particular documented link to that language. You do not need a language exam. You don't need a DALF or DELE or Oxford or TOEFL or whatever linguistic exam you may have taken. You need none of that. You have full liberty to choose any of the 24 or any of the 23. Now, again, we'll see the notice of competition, but I really don't expect any surprises there. Another big area, qualification. So what sort of diploma degree you need to have to be eligible for this competition? And what I'm expecting is a simple bachelor degree should be sufficient. So that should normally be enough for you to qualify. And we're not expecting any work experience to be required. Now, again, I'm saying the word expecting on purpose, because this will only be known on the day when the notice of competition is released. But given that it's an AD5 generalist exam, so I'll reveal to you our logic, our thinking of what is the base for this particular expectation. And the base is that for AD5 generalist positions, when you are hired, you're not required to have work experience. So that's why, again, I say it with a very high probability that you're not going to be expected to have work experience, because the institutions and the staff regulations of the EU officials and EU civil servants are not, that doesn't require you to have work experience. So almost certainly, and again, I can't say with full certainty until I've seen the notice of competition, but almost certainly you're not going to need any work experience. The diploma, we put that little asterisk because most likely a bachelor or 3-year degree will be sufficient. I would be quite surprised if they say, well, also a master's degree is required. But again, this is the most likely scenario, 3 years degree, so bachelor degree, which is either issued by an accredited and official European university, or you could do the equivalence if it was obtained outside of the EU, but then the authorities in Europe would consider that as an equivalent, and no work experience. So again, I say it with a fairly high confidence. Before I say why is this a great opportunity, I see there are many questions coming in. So why don't I take a look at some of those and quickly answer those? So fulfilled military service, what about women? Well, it doesn't concern the gender side of it. It's the requirement of the country of your citizenship. Now, without knowing any details how that works in any particular country, again, you need to just prove that you have fulfilled that requirement, or you've been exempted, or you've done whatever was expected from you by that particular country's legislation according to your citizenship. Santiago is asking, so it's more of a position for juniors as no experience is required. Now, that's a very relevant question. Yes and no. Yes, because juniors can definitely apply. So given that it doesn't require work experience, it only requires somewhat limited degrees, let's say, in terms of the years, the number of years of degrees. It doesn't require a PhD or what have you. So yes, juniors are absolutely welcome and encouraged, and they can definitely enter the system. Having said that, having work experience, 5 years, 10 years, so even quite a number of years and significant amount of experience that you may have gained in the civil, or in the public sector, or in private sector, or as self-employed, or in any capacity, it doesn't harm, it doesn't hurt. It definitely gives you more chances of securing an employment, getting hired once you're on the reserve list, because you have that experience, and that can be highly beneficial in some units and in some departments and in some specific positions. So yes, it's definitely a great opportunity for juniors. And at the same time, I know just in my own personal network, I know a lot of people who are interested, and they are definitely in the workplace or in the workforce for many, many years now. So it is definitely a possibility. And then having said that, many people who are in the institutions in one capacity or another already with temporary agents, contract agents, this is also an opportunity for them to get a permanent contract and to be hired as an AD5 permanent civil servant in the institutions. Maybe one more before we move on. Is internship experience considered part of work experience? Typically, the rule is that it needs to have been obtained after your degree, which is the minimum requirement for a competition. So let's say after your bachelor degree, you did some internship afterwards and not part of your education, and it needs to be a paid internship. So as long as it was paid and you can prove that with salary slips or any other way, normally that would be considered as a work experience. But again, work experience is not something we're expecting to be a requirement for this competition. Therefore, the work experience is relevant, but at a later stage when you are hired, and then they look at whether or not you have work experience. Because if so, then they can place you in a somewhat higher salary grade, respecting, or let's say considering the work experience that you've gained, because that has a small impact on the actual salary bracket into which you would be placed. All right. Before I go back to other questions, let's go back to the slides. If you switch back, let's see why this is a great opportunity. Now, many of you may be intimately familiar with how the institutions work and more than that, but what sort of benefits they give. But just for others, to make sure that we do a full recap, that there's a pretty comprehensive and generous health insurance system. There are European schools. So if you have children or will have children, they can study in your main language. Well, I say that with a caveat. So in one of the EU's 24 official languages, and follow the curriculum of that particular country or educational system. And then certainly the salaries are a big pull because they are attractive, especially for those who are relatively early in their careers. Now, I say that again with the caveat, like I described, that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's juniors only, but depending on a lot of circumstances, these are pretty good salaries. And actually, we have a salary calculator on the EU training website. That's a free tool. You can look it up. You can play with it. You can do different variables. So we did a simulation on that basis, and this is based on all the numbers and figures that the EU institutions apply. So you take a grade, which is AD5, and we said salary step 1. So that assumes you have no work experience. But if you have, I think, 3 or 6 or a certain number of years, that has a small impact on it. What has a bigger impact is whether you're married, whether you have children, and some other factors, so the household allowance. But ultimately, this translates into 4,800, yeah, I said it right, euro net salary per month, based on these variables and based on these things. Now, let's actually look at the competition phases. So let's actually look through what steps you need to take, what exams you need to pass, and how you need to prepare to succeed and be on the reservist in the end. So it's a pretty straightforward system. It's been streamlined over the years quite a bit. And what you can see is there's the process begins by you applying when the notice of competition is officially released, which we're expecting to be in July this year, so July 2025. We don't know which date. It's in the forward planning, currently marked as to be confirmed. Rumors that we've been hearing is that this is still the calendar that they work by. So hopefully it's going to hold. My intuition, and I've been saying it for some time, is that there might be some small delay, slight delay, which again is based on nothing else, just my intuition, really. There's no factual basis to it. Now, even if that's the case, it's still going to happen, perhaps not in July. In that case, and August is a pretty silent month because it's vacation time all over. In that case, it might be pushed back to September. But again, I'm saying it very transparently that there is nothing to it other than my hunch. But hopefully, and I'm hoping for everyone's sake, that this is going to they're going to hold to their original calendar, which is July. Though, again, I say that with a bit of smirk. Maybe it's not that bad if they launch it in September, because in August, you're not going to spend your time on the beach learning about comitology and implementing and delegated acts. So again, we will see how that plays out, but certainly there's great momentum and even pressure on EPSO and the selection board that they will appoint to really release this competition according to the plan. Certainly one big variable is the IT part, meaning since all the tests are run remotely, there needs to be a provider that does, as the name suggests, provides the right infrastructure and the right tools and makes sure that it's scalable for that amount of candidates that they are expecting. So there might be we need to see how that plays out, because there's a procurement going on. So they are going to make a contract with a provider that can run these remotely administered, remotely procured tests reliably at such a scale. So going back to it, application process, there are the tests, which is a set of tests that we're going to look at. Then they actually check, so to say, on the back end. So that doesn't concern you directly, but they check your eligibility based on the documents you will have submitted by that point. and then in the end, reserve list. So pretty straightforward and pretty streamlined process, because that's another goal of EPSO, that they want to make sure that the process is expedited and it doesn't drag on for a year and a half as it used to. But broadly speaking, this can be run in a 6-month period or a 6-month timeline. I'm not sure that's entirely feasible, but again, it's at least a good benchmark that they're aiming at. So application process, first and foremost, you create an account, and they've revamped a little bit the single account that you can create, even if you apply afterwards for multiple competitions. You create an account, pretty straightforward, not much to say there. There are parts on motivation, why you would like to work for the institutions. That is not a decisive factor for your application or even your exam performance, but it might be looked at a time of recruitment. So if you succeed, they might look at your motivation here and there. Again, take it seriously, do your best, fill it out to the best of your abilities. And you can submit your applications in any of the 24 languages, which, again, sometimes we get the question, well, I'm Romanian, and should I fill it in English? Or I'm Spanish, and should I do it in English or French or any other language? Yeah, look, there's nothing super consequential to say, but perhaps you might consider English, French, or German, because it's just easier in the end, again, after the whole selection procedure, to look at your profile and see the different variables there. But formally, legally speaking, you can really do it in any language that is an EU official language you wish. So it's not a very consequential decision to make. More importantly, or perhaps most importantly, let's look at the specific tests that you need to sit and you need to succeed in to succeed at the competition as a whole and ultimately be on the reserve list and get a job. So there are essentially 3 big building blocks, or 3 kinds of tests. And again, I know many of you who have tried other tests, you are quite familiar with those. Others who are new to this, they may be wondering what these tests are about. So just to be sure that everybody has a clear understanding of each of these, we're going to walk through the different components. Now, one thing that those of you who are following EU Careers EPSO exams for some time, they would immediately notice one thing missing. And one thing missing, well, missing not that it used to be part of competitions in the past, but it's been rumored, it's been discussed to be part of the AD5 Generalist competition. So a 4th element, which is called digital skills or digital literacy tests. Now, that's a big question mark, because it was widely discussed by those who are running these competitions, whether that component, that particular exam, should be part of the AD5 Generalist exam. So that digital literacy and questions about software use in Office, like Microsoft Office, and how to work with that. Questions around, very basic questions around cybersecurity. What's a phishing email with a PH? Phishing email where they try to steal your data or scam you. How do you ensure that your data is properly protected with 2-factor authentication? So again, not advanced in any sense. This is not for software engineers, not for IT experts, but a good digital literacy, which is certainly an essential knowledge, essential competence in today's work environment. Now, that particular test, we are anticipating that it's not going to be part of the AD5 Generalist in the end. So it was planned to be, but we don't think it's going to be part of it. Again, we will see as we see the notice of competition in July. But one reason I think is the language, because running that only in English would probably not comply with the linguistic rules, and it would be highly prone to litigation. So basically challenging it by the court, and translating all of that into the 24 official languages might have been a too difficult thing or prone to error. So we don't expect that part to be part of the test arsenal. Reasoning skills, EU knowledge test, and the EU FTE, meaning the EU free text essay, essentially a certain kind of written test. So let's go through each of those, what that means. So the numerical and abstract and verbal reasoning, these are the reasoning tests, sometimes referred to as CBT, computer-based tests, which is not exactly the most accurate term because practically speaking, all of these are computer-based tests because everything runs on your software, the software you will need to download and take the exam on your computer. By the way, that's something I'm going to come back to in a moment. So the verbal, abstract, and numerical reasoning, the three reasoning tests, also labeled in professional terms as psychometric tests. So these are part of any competition, and we're expecting this to be part of the AD5 Generalist just as much. And a pass-fail. So typically these are not ranked. So you're not going to be required to be among the top X number of candidates or percentage of candidates. It's a pass-fail. Now, the pass mark is to be seen because it's not necessarily 50%. It could be more elevated. The number of questions and the time, typically, basically almost every competition that we've seen over the past few months and years used 20 questions and 35 minutes for the verbal reasoning. So I'm not expecting any big change there. We'll see. But for transparency and to be accurate of what we know and what we don't know, I put there a question mark just to be sure that we need to double check that. But you see the proportion. So there's a high time pressure and there's a text passage, question statement, one correct answer. That is the approach that they're almost certainly going to take. So you need to be at the top of your game to quickly read it, process it, and answer it. Numerical reasoning, again, very standard is 10 questions and 20 minutes. So essentially 2 minutes per question. We're going to see if they keep using that proportion. Most likely, yes. Again, I have a very high degree of confidence that the proportion is going to be like this. But then again, to confirm when the official information comes out. And numerical reasoning, this is essentially about data interpretation, reasoning, estimation, calculation, where you have limited time to come up with the correct answer. One correct answer, typically based on a table, some sort of a chart, and then do logical and mathematical operations to come to the right answer. And often you don't need to actually calculate, you need to estimate or exclude the blatantly wrong answers. And then everyone's favorite, and I say that with some cynicism in my voice, the abstract reasoning, typically 10 questions in 10 minutes. So a very demanding task where you have a minute per question, where you have these cryptic esoteric charts and graphs and shapes that move according to a certain logic, and then you need to find the next one in the sequence. Yes, I can see Alberto from the corner of my eye, definitely my favorite. So I think Alberto, many others resonate with that feeling. But that's what we need to live with, and that's the requirement. So you need to be at the top of your game to be sure that you pass this. Now, when I come to the pass-fail ratio, this is going to be one of the most consequential points in the notice of competition, how they're going to allocate the calculation of the different scores. Because you have these three tests, the numerical, verbal, and abstract. What we have seen often is that they would combine the verbal and the abstract scores, and then there's a combined pass mark for these two. And then the numerical is set apart. But they might put the numerical and the abstract together, or they might not do that at all and have each of these three as separate, and you need to pass each three on their own merits. And the pass mark may not be 50%. So the pass mark might be 60%, or it might be determined differently. By the way, I would even add, I don't think they themselves know it yet. So I don't think that the selection board or EPSO internally, they have made up their minds how they're going to allocate the different points. Now, again, you can absolutely be sure that it's minimum 50%. We don't yet know, again, which two might be combined at all, but you can be absolutely sure that these will be part of the competition, and you can be sure that you need to practice and you need to perform well, because you don't want to risk failing the competition because you didn't get a high enough score in verbal or in numerical or in abstract. And then what's the purpose? Well, the purpose is, this is typically called in occupational psychology that these are tests to select candidates out, not select candidates in. So in the sense that it's an objective, impartial, and scalable system for a large number of candidates, basically to filter a large number of candidates. And so it's efficient, unbiased, and well, it helps find suitable candidates, or at least excludes the ones who are manifestly not suitable. And again, this is not a judgment on any of her skills or abilities, but this is a very common and standardized way in selection procedures and occupational psychology to have the selecting out and ease into the funnel those who can then be filtered through other tests who are more relevant to the actual job that you will be doing in the very end. And a couple points, and I want to highlight here, these are some slides from some of our methodology webinars. So we do a lot of training and with coaches, with trainers, with methodology webinars and other resources that we really walk you through the way that you can process these and you can optimize your performance and time and everything so you get great results in the end. But some points is sometimes you need to just move on from one question or one particular challenge to the next one because you need to skip it. You might want to mark it or rule it out to say, okay, this is definitely not something I'm going to spend my time with. I'm going to go for another task, another challenge where I have more chance of finding the correct answer and therefore succeeding, and not to be stuck for 3 minutes when time is so precious in these exams. And by the way, I often say, the challenge is not to find the correct answer. The challenge is to do that within the time available. So the time pressure is the one that makes it so difficult. Now, for verbal reasoning, well, you can do a lot because it's usually some longer passage of text that you need to look at, and you need to quickly scan it, use your peripheral vision. You may need to do some quick reading or speed reading exercise before. Actually, quite a few candidates try that so they can quickly process the key information in the text. Or you might want to look at the timer and to say, okay, I'm going to give myself 45 seconds to read the text, and 45 seconds per statement, and then 25 seconds per question to find which one I'm going to pick as the correct answer. And the sub-vocalizing, so you don't read out half loud or to yourself, but you actually process the information faster. And there are some sites like the Read Speed or Spreeder or a couple others where you can practice that kind of thing, and that eventually helps your performance. Numerical reasoning, again, there is a lot to say about it, and we really have those in-depth conversations or in-depth methodology coaching sessions or webinars of what you can do. But a couple highlights: data interpretation. You can do reasoning because it's more of a logical exercise, but at the same time you need to have some basic calculus. So you need to crunch the numbers. Good thing is you have a calculator on the screen. I'll mention that in a moment. And again, keep in mind that the questions are not in increasing order of difficulty. So it's not that the first one is relatively easy or very hard, the next one is going to be less hard or the contrary. So you get those questions in a, wouldn't say fully random order, but again, the level of difficulty may not be on a linear scale. And there are different ways of getting to the right answer. So it's not that there's only one way to come up with a formula or come up with the steps. You need to look for the fastest one. Again, the time pressure is a huge issue. And you do get the online calculator on screen, which does require a bit of dexterity where you can properly click the right thing and you can quickly come to the right to the proper results. So be familiar with how these online calculators interact and how you can manipulate them in the greatest at the greatest efficiency. And then we just listed here a couple of things that you might want to revise. Like if you throw me into a numerical reasoning right now, perhaps the division part or the percentage one on percentage points, it's not something that's going to come immediately quickly to me. How do I do it in the most efficient way? So these are mathematical or numerical reasoning related skills and things that you might want to revise. We actually have a webinar called Math Refresher. So if you feel that you need to brush up on your math skills, we have that, and there are many other resources as well. Abstract reasoning, so 10, 20 questions. Again, we need to see exactly how many, likely 10. There are different steps and 1 minute per question, but the biggest question is like, how do you approach it? And you have those 10 minutes, you need to be even strategic with your time when it comes to those 10 minutes. So how much time do you spend at the beginning, towards the end? What do you do in the last 2 or 3 minutes? Or you go back to questions that you marked and you want to be sure about. I want to spend a few minutes on the next bit. So we've seen the abstract verbal numerical tests kind of as a it used to be called a pre-selection. It's no longer pre-selection, but that's the first phase. But the next one is the EU knowledge test. So EU knowledge is perhaps the one that is challenging for many because it's a vast body of knowledge that you need to know. We're expecting 40 minutes and 30 questions, and the pass mark being 15 out of 30. Again, many question marks there of how many they eventually end up putting, because this is going to be ranked. So the candidates will be ranked based on the scores in the EU knowledge test. And the ranking eventually determines if they keep looking at your application or keep looking at your results, if the free text essay is scored or the eligibility is checked, etc. Because if those who are out at this stage, the rest of the thing is not going to be checked. But you need to go through each and every step when you take the exam. This is not done live. This is not done at the moment of you sitting the exam. You need to do everything, send it in, and then they will take a look at all the results and everything else. So what is covered in the EU knowledge? Well, EU knowledge is vast, right? Like there's so much to know. We will see how much information they give out in advance of what you need to cover. And I put there a little asterisk to the history because based on what we've heard, history may not be directly part of what you're expected to know. So they're not going to ask you what was the Schuman Declaration or what happened with the empty chair crisis and all the other things related to EU knowledge. But again, it sets the scene. It's helpful to know. But what you almost certainly need to focus on is all the procedures. So all the decision-making procedures in the EU and all the institutions. So institutions, both in a legal sense institutions, but EU bodies and EU agencies and all the others. So we listed many of those here. And obviously the policies. So the policy is the most tricky one because that's pretty broad, right? But when it comes to, before I go to the policies, so the institutions, procedures, history, well, the good news is right behind me, I put there shamelessly the new book that we just published with a very good friend of mine, Sonia. It's called The Ultimate EU Handbook, and that essentially covers that part. So history, procedures, institutions, and I trust that it's let's say deep enough, but not academically deep that it's an overkill and very hard to process, but it does include everything that is relevant for that kind of knowledge. And when it comes to the policies, so really there are many EU policies obviously out there that the EU deals with. So from research to climate change to energy to trade to digital economy and many others. And there are many resources where you could take that information from, of not just the most current affairs, but more specifically, what's the structure? What's the decision making? What are the key components, the key building blocks of an EU policy? And there are a couple of resources we listed here. You'll see that when we send you the slides. I'm not going to go through all of these. And there are different websites. The Parliament has great resources, Commission. So these are stuff that you can look up, including books from Joan Harper Publishing, which is the publisher that has published my EU test book and the EU handbook. So thank you for mentioning that in the comments I see from the corner of my eyes. And again, there are many others from news websites, Politico, Euractiv, think tanks, and different thought leaders. Again, this helps you, especially if you're new to the EU affairs, is that you have the structured way of looking at the knowledge and then filling that in with actual events. And that's a much better way, because if you say, oh, there is a huge trade dispute right now with US and generally the international multilateral trade, okay, what's the structure around trade policy? And then you can link that to current events. Now, at EPSO exams, typically they will not ask you anything about current events. They will ask you about stuff that's established knowledge, formally adopted, established knowledge. Now, how to prepare? We also have the EU course. So that's a course on the EU training website that you can find under the products menu. It's an e-learning course, which is very comprehensive. And the book, the EU handbook, has been modeled on this one. And that's where we have flowcharts and graphs and explanations. And yours truly, I also presented along with 3 other colleagues who explain all of this, institutions, procedures, and some EU history. And by the way, we also put that on Spotify. for a small subscription fee where you can listen to these courses as an audio. So all the 12 hours of the EU knowledge that I mentioned, it's also available on Spotify. Look for EU course. So you type in EU course, and then you should find out it says podcast, not exactly a podcast, but definitely like an audiobook. And I want to say a few words about the last bit, which is the EU FTE. They just love these abbreviations, don't they? Where you have the EU free text essay. So it's a special kind of written test, an essay, essentially, on general EU matters. So here they're going to give you some assignment. So basically, write a brief description of something, or write a briefing on something, or write a background note on something related to an EU matter at large. Now, we don't yet know, but again, with a fairly high degree of confidence, we can say that there's going to be a background document. So they're going to release 2 weeks before, which is what they've been doing for all other competitions, a background document, which is an official EU document. Could be a communication, could be a piece of legislation, something that exists in all 24 official languages, to take that as a baseline or as a background, as a context, based on which they're going to ask you a specific assignment question at the exam. So it's not that you need to memorize the document, but you need to be familiar with its contents, with its structure, with its key messages, and all the rest. And that's going to frame the actual exercise, the EU free text essay. Now, the scoring, we're going to see whether it's on a scale of 10 with a 5-point pass mark. Likely, but I can't guarantee this. So we're going to see this when the actual competition is launched in July. But again, directionally, you can reasonably expect that it's 40 minutes, meaning short time. It's not that you're going to have 2 hours. It's not that you're going to have 3 hours to write the long assignment. Short time, to the point, and you need to apply all the tools of clear communication. So study clear writing methods and techniques. Again, good news, we have webinars and workshops specifically on that. You look at the background documents, you can do simulations. We have on our website simulations. You can already take a look at those and you pick it. We offer that you can do it kind of a self-study, but you can have personal, individual feedback from some of our experts. And we are actually going to have a webinar on the 4th of June where we talk about insights related to the EU free text essay. So that's pretty much, these are the exams, right? The abstract verbal numerical reasoning, the EU knowledge test, and the free text essay. And then I briefly mentioned digital skills, which is quite likely not going to be part of that particular package. Then eligibility check, which happens pretty much in the background, where you will have submitted all the documents, and then they check whether your declarations match with the documents or the documents corroborate the declarations. And then there's a reservist, where it's not ranked, but that's what gives you the right, well, not so much the right to be employed, but the possibility to be hired on that basis. And then the recruitment services, be that at the commission, the council, the court of auditors, or what have you, they can contact you, and you can also proactively try to apply for open positions. So how to get the job? Well, there's a lot to say there, and I see there are quite a few questions. Before I get there, let me answer one or two. Is there an age limit? No, there's no age limit. So age limit maybe on the lower end, so to say, well, you cannot be 18 unless you're a genius and you have all the documents and the degrees that they require. But again, no minimal or maximal. The minimal is kind of decided by you completing all the formal requirements, and there's no age limit. So even if you're in your 40s or 50s and you decide that this is a good career path that you'd like to give it a try, you can absolutely do that. And does the language we choose for the application need to be the same one that we'll choose for the test? No. So the application form and all those online forms, they can be filled out in any of the 24 languages, but then you specifically pick and choose language 1 and language 2. And there's a lot to, well, not so lot to say, but there are some things to say about the languages. The first language and the second language has an impact on the test, because usually the abstract verbal numerical reasoning is taken in language 1. So pick a language 1 in which you can process the information very quickly. You understand it quickly. You get the gist of it very quickly. And then language 2 is often the one in which you take the written test, in this case, your EU free text essay. And then we're going to see what the EU knowledge test, the multiple choice quiz EU knowledge test, in which language will that be? Language 1 or 2? I'm guessing language 2. So language 2 will need to be a language in which you can actively express yourself in writing with good spelling and with proper sophistication, and just generally you're comfortable writing and actively expressing yourself in that language. I often say, you may have heard me say in other webinars, where I wouldn't choose language 2 as French, because even if I speak it fairly well, my spelling is not great. So I would probably not pick that as language 2, because I don't want to give in a very messy and full of grammatical, maybe not grammatical errors. That's quite okay. But then again, French spelling is another level, as anyone who speaks the language would tell you. So there is that kind of consideration of what's language 1 or language 2. And that is something you want to think about. And then before we finish off with the slides, because I have a few left and 4 minutes left in respect of everyone's time, how can you increase your chances to get a job once you are on the reserve list? And actually, that is a webinar exactly on that. So how to get a job once you're on the reserve list. That's a webinar that's on our website. And there are certain things you can do. You can get access to certain vacancy lists, and you can proactively apply, and certain things you can highlight. And there are a couple of other best practices and methods that are worth sharing. So that's in that webinar, but we're happy to guide you or help you in any way we can. So let's go back to the slides for a second, and to say how to get the job. Well, you get the job by practicing. You get the job by preparing regularly. And it's not necessarily 1 hour or 10 hours, really. The baseline matters a lot. Where are you now in numerical reasoning? How much do you know about the EU? Did you study EU political science or something, and you're pretty familiar with all the stuff? Or you are a mechanical engineer who decides to pursue a career of this kind, and you haven't dealt with EU affairs at all? Certainly, the level and the time of the preparation matters a great deal in that particular case. Learn methodology. Very important to understand that there is a system to it. It's crazy talk, but there's a system to it. There's a method where you can optimize your numerical reasoning. There's a method, even method in your EU knowledge studies, to be systematic and methodical. And by the way, we have a preparation planner. So if you type preparation planner, there's a tool which we just put out. It's a free tool, AI powered, on our site, where that helps you come up with a plan depending on when the exam is and how much time you have available and where your weaknesses are. And then do simulations for sure. Again, a couple of pointers as to what resources you can use. We have a lot of free resources, free webinars and ebooks and many other resources. And then some are paid depending on how much personal involvement there is, or how much depth or to what depth we go to. And there's personal coaching, if that helps you, and various webinars, like I mentioned. We have, for the EU knowledge, we have briefings. So there's the EU briefings, which we have launched a couple of weeks ago, available on our site. 2 are free. There are 18 in total. And that gives a pretty concise summary of the key building blocks and main figures and numbers and other descriptors of that particular policy, from trade to competition, to digital, to agriculture, to education, and all the others. And certainly I mentioned the EU knowledge. There is the EU handbook and many others. And then we have the webinar coming up on the 4th of June, the free text essay webinar, a methodology and other insights that you can use. And by the way, the EU test book is certainly applicable here. A new edition, not completely new, with all transparency and honesty. So we updated it. It's an incremental improvement where we kept the bulk of it, but then we added a couple of new chapters and a couple more, a couple hundred more EU knowledge tests and a couple other things. It's coming out in a couple of weeks. So I'd say by mid-May, it should be in the bookshops. So the 2025 edition of the EU test book. And then again, the free resources, the preparation planner. And those of you who are interested, on the 17th of April, we're doing here an Ask Me Anything session with Luke, who actually used to work for EPSO. And literally, you can ask anything related to EU careers. We'll be happy to answer it. But like I said, there are a couple of questions I didn't get to today. I will record a dedicated session within a week and share that with you for all the questions that I didn't have time to answer, and make sure that you can see it and watch it. And finally, community with Facebook, with LinkedIn, and all the others. And then there's a dedicated package that we offer for the AD5. So with all the components that we mentioned, we have verbal reasoning in all 24 official languages, even smaller languages from Maltese to Lithuanian or some others. All of that is available along with the free text essay evaluation. And we'll be happy to give 20% off, which is based on a code that will be communicated to you in your inbox in the email. Whoa, I can't believe we're right on time, 1:30. That's amazing. I would really like to say a huge thank you to India and to Rita and to David and everyone who helped put this together. It's been very intense work to make sure that we can cover everything to the degree that's possible in an hour. But like I said, we're going to follow up with the different resources, the slides, the video, and the answered questions in a couple of days. And I trust that this was helpful. It gave you a pretty comprehensive idea of what the exam is about, what are different components. Again, with the big disclaimer and caveat that the final word is going to be in the notice of competition on, I don't know on which day, but in July 2025, in 3 months. But if we hear something which we consider authoritative and final, we're going to communicate that to you in one shape or form. But we're likely going to do a next edition of this particular webinar once we have all those variables in place with the numbers and figures and timing and scores. But again, you can already start planning your preparation. You can already get ready for the big day, which, by the way, is likely going to be around October. So if the exam is actually launched in July, our calculation says that roughly in October is when the exam is going to take place. So with that, I encourage you to send us a message if we can be helpful with anything through the contact form. The team is there, and we're very happy to guide you, to point you to the right resource or give you information. And as always, we will tell you if we don't know. If we don't know, we don't know. We will tell you. And that's why I think it's very important, because there is a lot of information there and some uncertainty, though not as much as you might have thought an hour ago. So with that, thank you so much for being here, spending your lunch break if you are in the same time zone as we are. And to be continued, thank you for being here, and speak to you soon.